On March 25, representatives of Russia, China, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela wrote a letter to Antonio Guterres, United Nations Secretary General, asking to lift the one-sided sanctions introduced by the U.S. against them, particularly in the light of the way these sanctions have affected their fight against the spread of coronavirus. While the Americans claim their sanctions do not affect humanitarian aid nor the medical and food supply of other countries, in Iran and Syria, for example, these areas are being targeted almost directly. The main reason Iran was unable to diagnose infected people entering the country 2 months ago was their limited supply of vessels and medical equipment. The country also had a limited amount of the protective equipment needed by medical staff to handle patients with the virus. For this reason, many doctors, nurses, and high-ranking officials or people close to them were infected when they had to visit infected patients unprotected. While the sanctions may not explicitly prohibit humanitarian items, the financial attack on Iran has made some companies unwilling to export critical supplies for fear of a U.S. government backlash. Amid the pandemic, Washington has said that it will not provide sanctions relief. In fact, it is upping its attack on Iran, adding further sanction as part of its maximum pressure campaign to decimate Iran's oil sector. Meanwhile, in Syria, despite supposed humanitarian exemptions, sanctions have hit Syrian healthcare hard, affecting procurement of medicines by preventing transactions with foreign banks and stopping any international drug company from dealing with the country. The Trump administration has gone so far as to forbid the passage of aid ships to Syria. U.S. sanctions are devastating in ordinary times, but with the COVID-19 pandemic raging, they're killing more people than ever. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. While U.S. officials claim their sanctions do not affect humanitarian aid nor the medical and food supply of other countries, in Iran and Syria, these areas are being targeted almost directly. To discuss this issue with us from Washington is Dr. Ziad Al-Hafiz, former Secretary General of the Arab National Conference. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Ziad. Now, the U.S. sanctions are devastating in ordinary times. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic raging, they're killing more people than ever. Most countries that have been stricken heavily with the COVID-19 are already suffering from economic sanctions imposed by the U.S. on these sovereign nations, if you will. Is there no end here to U.S. harassment or bullying, especially at these extensively hard times?
Well, as long as you have the Trump administration in office, it is unlikely to see any abatement of the sanctions. However, the pressure is increasingly growing on the United States and on all those who are toeing the line for the United States. For instance, next Saturday, the Arab International Center for Humanitarian Solidarity is holding a virtual conference over the internet, over the social media, calling all upon political activists, intellectuals all over the Arab world to condemn or to stand in solidarity with the peoples who are the subject of such sanctions. And I think one of the resolutions that are going to come up is to consider such sanctions as a war crime. In fact, all economic sanctions and economic warfare is becoming now more and more of a war crime than just as a tool of political, let's say, competition. And therefore, I think the world is going to change in the aftermath of the pandemic. And I think the United States is going to be isolated, really isolated, with the exception, of course, Fiji and Israel. These are the only countries that are going to stand with them. So having said that, I think we have to wait until November to see whether the elections are going to produce some other kind of leadership in the United States. Otherwise, it is in the cards that such sanctions are going to continue. And I don't think this administration is in the mood or has the capability of backing down from its former stance.
Well, Dr. Hafiz, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. economic warfare was killing cancer patients in Iran, keeping Syrian children with cancer from getting necessary medicine because of the blockade on the aid going into Syria. And according to an estimate by two U.S. economists, they said that these sanctions have killed perhaps 40,000 Venezuelans. Now, they are collectively punishing an entire population because of a certain policy that they don't like in this government or in that government. But what do you think will happen to the image and to the efficacy of the U.S. Government worldwide after the COVID-19 pandemic is over?
Well, as I just said, it is basically a war crime. There is no way of hiding it. It is basically a war crime as despicable as all the horrors that have been witnessed in various wars, bloody wars. This is another way of waging war.
You think they really care about that?
Well, I think they will have to care about it whether they like it or not. Now, the United States has been isolated politically, and now the way the United States has been treating its allies over this pandemic has created significant tension that I don't think they're going to be repaired in the near future. Even if you have a new administration that comes in November or early January next year, I think the damage has been done, and the main ally of the United States by which it can enforce that kind of sanction that's in Europe is going to have second thoughts about continuing this kind of line. So I do not believe that this policy is sustainable for the United States in the long run. But it cannot change. I don't think I expect it to change with the present administration. So you have to wait. Now, if for some unfortunate reason Mr. Trump is re-elected, you're going to have more of the same. And therefore, you're going to have more of a cleavage between the United States and the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world may take finally some action and say, let's cut all the relations with the United States. They don't want us to do our own business. We're not going to do business with them, as simple as that. Whether they get to that stage or not remains to be seen. But I think this is where the trend is going if this policy is continued to be implemented by the United States.
Well, the actual sanctions, as you said, they are war crimes, but they may not really explicitly just prohibit humanitarian items in certain countries. But the financial attack on Iran had made some companies afraid of doing any kind of business with Iran because of any certain U.S. backlash, U.S. government backlash here. On the contrary, we have seen that the U.S. is upping the ante against Iran, saying that they will increase the sanctions to increase maximum pressure on the government. But this is an act of war. How do you think Iran will actually retaliate soon enough?
Well, that's a question more to the Iranian leadership to be asked, not to me. But I think in the current situation, Iran has to stand fast. There is no other way. I don't think an open conflagration in the region is now in the best interest of Iran. I think the way things are moving in the region are not to the advantage of the United States. So there is no need to wage war against the United States or to undertake any military action. By and large, the United States are withdrawing from the area. We have seen some withdrawals in Iraq, we have seen some withdrawals in Syria, and we are seeing some withdrawals in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. They're going to leave the area because they cannot sustain. They are in a very hostile environment. So I don't think, given the actual balance of forces, there is a need for Iran to take the drastic action. And I think Iran has managed to, despite the blockade, despite all the pressures that have been put on it, to overcome to a large extent this pandemic, even though it has paid a very heavy price. And I think it's going to come up more stronger than that. And I don't believe that the United States has gained. I think it has lost a strategic battle in this kind of warfare, and it has also lost whatever it had in the region. Even the traditional allies of the United States, like the Gulf states, are now conducting a significant revision of their policy, and you can see their effect in the openings that have been launching towards Syria, which means that at the end of the day, the security of the region is not going to be in the hands of the United States, but in the hands of the parties concerned, basically the country, the region itself. So the United States has lost significantly, and the economic blockade it has been enforcing upon Syria, upon Iran, upon all its adversaries, is going to have a backlash against them. And we can see
Before we speak
already.
about that backlash, I have a question concerning Syria here, because the sanctions on Syria, the economic sanctions on Syria, they have hit the Syrian healthcare system badly. We are seeing affecting procurement of medicines by preventing transactions with any foreign banks and not allowing any international drug agency to have any relations with the government. It has cost lots of innocent lives in Syria. I myself was a witness of a loss of a 4-year-old child. It was dramatic and drastic and catastrophic for the family because of no supplies, medical supplies. But clearly, the Trump administration is using the kill them with sanctions strategy. But they are always ready to up the ante. What do they have in their files left that they could use against Syria, for example?
Well, just before we started this interview, I was watching the interview given by the governor of New York, Mr. Cuomo. And he said the irony is that we have been demonizing China, we have been attacking China, and we have been sanctioning China, and everything that we need to fight the pandemic virus, corona, is coming from China. The masks, the gowns, the protective shield, etc. Even the medicine is coming from China. So this is becoming to be ridiculous. This is where I think is going to be the opening of that kind of attitude is no longer a feasible or an economic, it's not economically feasible for the United States to conduct, because the backlash is going to be extremely severe. And it's already severe in terms of fighting the pandemic within the United States, that still has to import from its designated enemy, China. It still needs the Chinese to help that kind of stuff. So therefore, I do not believe that it is a sustainable policy. It will have to change, but it means also that there must be a change in the administration, because this administration has gone too far, and I don't think it has the capability of backpedaling and changing course.
Dr. Ziad Al-Hafiz, Secretary General, former Secretary General of the Arab National Conference, thank you very much for joining us from Washington to talk about the devastating U.S. sanctions on several Middle Eastern countries. Please stay tuned for our next segment, also about sanctions against Yemen and how it's fighting the COVID-19. Please stay tuned. Yemen's war shows no signs of abating 10 days after the Saudi-led military coalition declared a unilateral truce. Simultaneously, Yemen announced its first case of COVID-19 as aid organizations warned the country's health system, which has all but collapsed since the Saudi aggression against Yemen broke out in 2014, is ill-equipped to handle the crisis. Yemen under war fights COVID-19 in this following report. health systems to battle coronavirus, they must not ignore the plight of Yemenis who are already under attack. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Muna Issa, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Muna. Now, Yemen reported its first coronavirus case in April 10, and the 8 groups that are operating inside of Sana'a braced for an outbreak in a country where war has actually shattered health systems and it has spread hunger and disease all across the country. Now, that a bit reminds me of a mock ceasefire unilaterally presented by the Saudi-led coalition, where they said they will stop the bombing to help out with the COVID-19 pandemic against Yemen. How is that going so far?
Well, Saudi Arabia, since its issuing of this unilateral agreement to stop bombing Yemen, a few moments after, as we can observe, they continued with their air campaign as per usual. And this could be explained by political motivations. Saudi Arabia, in order to express some sort of moral high ground in front of the international community, issued this agreement, as one might say. Another explanation for this preposterous behavior is they aim to delay any sort of peace talks between the Houthis and other factions that might put a rock in their aims to further bomb Yemen into weakness and submission.
Well, Mona, UN humanitarian coordinator Liz Grand told Reuters that if this virus actually spreads in Yemen, it would be catastrophic. The impact would be catastrophic for the country. Really? This is all what the UN has to say about everything that's going on, a pandemic, while they are being bombed? This is what they have to say while they're fighting the COVID-19 under a blockade?
Well, I think that we usually put overconfidence into how the UN functions. I think we have a lot of faith in them, but this shouldn't be the case at all. For the reason that the United Nations is an entity or a body which functions through bureaucracies, through governments, through corporate interests, as one might say. And the main funder of the United Nations is the United States. So it's not quite surprising, and they keep hindering the fact that there is a blockade. And if they were serious about providing humanitarian aid to the Yemeni people who are starving and plagued by disease, they would have been serious about lifting the blockade and ending the war on Yemen. However, it's also important to note the fact that there are sanctions which have been recently renewed by the United Nations on Yemen. So not only are they keeping aid from the Yemeni people, but they are also part of the problem here. So we shouldn't put that much faith into the United Nations and how it functions as a humanitarian.
Especially the World Food Program issue, the stopping the funding from Yemen later on. But let's talk a bit about what's going on inside of Yemen, inside of the different governorates in Yemen. We had Taha al-Mutawakkil, the Yemeni health minister, warning that 93% of the country's medical equipment is out of service because of the constant Saudi war on Yemen. This is exactly what he announced last week. So the country's medical infrastructure has been drained over 5 years of brutal war, leave it especially vulnerable to any sort of pandemic. We even saw cholera. Why not see a pandemic like COVID-19 as well? But I need to talk about what the real reason behind delaying any sort of an actual full ceasefire with lifting the blockade, with allowing aid ships to enter. I mean, even the US, they not only stopped 17 aid ships to enter to Yemen, they confiscated the ships as if they need the aid. So what is going on there? What is the real reason for the Saudi Arabian kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, to say that I will pursue this war? What is he looking after now?
Well, so we're talking about why isn't the Saudi-UK coalition withdrawing from Yemen, ending the blockade, having a permanent ceasefire. So we're talking about exit strategy, right? So we have to think about first, what kind of strategy has Saudi Arabia been employing for the past 5 years?
Basically killing?
Sorry.
Basically
killing.
Well,
yes. Yeah. So what Saudi Arabia has been doing is that, unlike other colonialists, which say use divide and conquer strategy, for instance, Saudi Arabia has indiscriminately bombed, starved, and deprived millions and millions of people from basic human necessities. And this is also backed by the narrative that they keep pushing, that they keep fighting, say, Houthi insurgents, but rather it has pushed an entire generation, an entire population into so much physical, mental, cultural trauma. So what's happening here is that in order to save face, Saudi Arabia would rather stay in Yemen, holding it captive in its aggression, due to the fact that it has not achieved any of its geostrategic goals. And this is a very, very important point we have to shed light upon. 5 years into war, and Saudi Arabia hasn't achieved any geostrategic goals, despite its colonial interests in taking control over Yemen, as per history. So this is why this isn't ending anytime soon. So, and this is also part of the reason why they keep they're exploiting the ceasefire to keep bombing Yemen.
Well,
so,
yeah. You mentioned before about the role of the UN, how it's actually an imperial role, rather a role of at least being on the sideline, trying to help. But no, on the contrary, what happened is the World Food Program, which is part of the UN organization, they announced that later this week, they announced last Thursday that this week it will cut up the aid that it gives to the people in Yemen. It will cut it because, according to them, they have concerns that Ansarullah is taking the aid and not giving it to the people. Despite the fact that this is preposterous, but this is not a war crime according to international law, or is it?
Any kind of action that deprives people from basic human necessities is a war crime. If you look at countries around the world like Iran and Venezuela, whose mortality rates have increased throughout the period of the sanctions, and how many, for example, treatments that are not locally industrialized and they have to import from other countries, etc., and such scenarios. I mean, anything that pushes a population into poverty and that kind of it's physical abuse, in my humble opinion, that's a crime against humanity, and obviously no one wants to have that conversation. But other than that, it's not very surprising that the international community is dealing with the Yemen crisis in such a way, because if you look at the recent behavior, let's take the European Union, for instance. They are snatching masks and sanitizers from each other, and these are allies. So imagine what kind of behavior they might here into the third world. So it's not very surprising. Other than that, the World Food Program also, people put so much faith into these organizations. There's something called a disaster capitalism, where these organizations, because they function through governmental funds, and sponsors and corporates, they function within their interests, and they don't function on supply and demand of populations that are disadvantaged and need. They function on managing conflict after the goals have been achieved. So because Saudi Arabia and the UK have not achieved their strategic goals in Yemen, it's not within their interest to provide aid and food, regardless of the millions that are in need of it.
And the Global South has hundreds of examples to give to show exactly and prove what you are saying. Muna, I want to thank you very much, Muna Isa, political commentator, for joining us from Beirut to talk about how Yemen is fighting COVID-19 while facing a brutal war by Saudi Arabia. Thank you for being with us, and please, everyone, stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.